In this video, we'll take just a very brief tour of some of the GUI design tools available to us in Visual Studio. And it begins with the new project dialog when we choose what kind of a project we're going to create. Typically, students have spent a lot of time creating what we call console applications. Console application is an application that uses a text-based user interface. When we're ready to move on to a graphical user interface, we have two choices. We have Windows Forms applications and WPF, which stands for Windows Presentation Foundation applications. We are going to use Windows Forms in this course, which is the older technology. WPF is considered the preferred way moving forward to design your graphical user interfaces. But it does add a little bit of complication over Windows Forms, and there's also this practical matter that our textbooks, it's hard to find a textbook that covers WPF. So unfortunately what happens is that students spend a lot of time in Windows Forms, whereas in industry, if you're creating a new project, you're typically going to go with WPF. But there is a lot of Windows Forms code out there. It's a good skill to have, and it's a logical building block before you move on to WPF. So we're okay in that regard. So I'm going to go ahead and create a Windows Forms application here. And the first thing you're going to notice is that the screen will look a little bit different when we're creating a project that uses Windows Forms. Rather than going straight to program.cs, which is where we are used to seeing the main method, we're instead going to have this tool called the Windows Forms Designer, or the form design tool. And so we get a preview of what our GUI is going to look like when we run the program. And in fact, if I just run it now, and give it a moment to compile. What we're going to see is that we end up with a program that looks exactly like what we have created in the designer. So it is easy to get confused visually because they look so similar, and it's easy to kind of mix up whether or not you're looking at the application you're running and debugging, or you're looking at the design tool. So we always can use the stop button here to stop our program from running if we're feeling lost. So that's the Windows Forms Designer, kind of the layout view. And the other important feature that we're going to see on our screen is what we call the toolbox. And the toolbox, by default, is minimized over here on the left. And so I want to open that up. And since we're going to use it a lot, I like to pin it open. Some people prefer, if you have a smaller screen especially, to just have it pop out on demand. Since my computer clearly doesn't have a lot of horsepower, I like to just leave it open. And our toolbox panel over here will have all of the controls that we're going to use to create our GUI. And the properties panel, which is in the bottom right, gives us all the properties for whatever control we have selected at the time. So we can see in our toolbox that we're broken up into categories to make things easier to find. And if you go to all, you can see all of them. But we'll just take a look at common controls. And so what we can see by looking at this list is that the term control really means all of the little things that we can put onto our form to make our graphical user interface. So a button, if I drag and drop, I can get a button there. And we all know what a button does. We're used to working with them all the time. If I want to allow the user to enter some text, I can use a text box. All right, if I want to display some text to the user, I can use a label. And it's all very visual. The term for this is what you see is what you get, or WYSIWYG is the abbreviation. And so it's very intuitive. And you can just use this to build all the elements that you're going to need for your graphical user interface. And I can see if I run this now, I have a basic little program here that I can interact with. So I can click on the text box and I can enter some text. I can click the button. And at the moment, nothing really happens. The user interface doesn't really respond to what I do with it, other than in default ways. If I click the button, I can see a little click kind of animation visually. But the program doesn't do anything. So GUIs in Windows Forms are built on this idea of what we call event-driven programming. And what that means is that there are all kinds of events happening at the moment. Every time I move my mouse, there's an event happening. If I click in the text box, that's an event. If I type something, that's an event. If I click the button, that's an event. And what I want to do is write some code that will respond to those events, and we call that code event handlers. So a big part of what we're going to do is write event handlers. Before we take a quick look at that, I just want to point out a big part of what you'll spend this module learning about is the properties that are associated with these controls. So properties impact the way, they're settings essentially for what the control looks like and how it behaves. And if I want to change what this button says so that it doesn't say button 1, I can single click on the button, I can find the text property, and I can make it say whatever I want. So if I want it to say submit, I can say submit. I can resize it by setting the height and the width here. Okay. I can also, of course, resize it by dragging the handles. If I want to change the font, there's a little font property here, and it's got a little dialog that will pop up and give us the good old-fashioned Windows font dialog that we're used to. So let's say I want to make it a little bigger. There we go. What I want to emphasize right now is it's very important, for reasons that aren't always clear to beginners, but it is very important to always give your controls appropriate names. And it's an easy thing to forget. It's one of those things like commenting your code that a lot of programmers don't value and don't take the time to do, but it's very important. And you can, honestly, you can name them however you want, just like your variables, but there is a convention that is typically followed, and that is to use a little prefix to indicate what type of control it is, followed by a descriptive name. And so buttons, the prefix is BTN, okay, BTN, and then I usually just say whatever the text indicates, so BTN submit. All right. Now, if I want to change my label to say enter your name, I'm going to single click the label, go down to the text property, say enter your name. I have to rearrange it to fit now. And I should name that label. I'll use the prefix LBL for a label, and I don't want to type out enter your name. That's pretty unwieldy, so I'll just abbreviate it or shorten it, and I'll say LBL name. Now, labels and text boxes often go together, so the label describes what we want the user to input. So the text box should have a similar name, but with a different prefix. So I use TXT for a text box, and I'm going to call it TXT name. And I can always check my controls in the properties window here. There's a little drop down where I can see all of the controls that are part of my form. I actually also like to name my form itself, FRM, I'll just call it name, or FRM greeting maybe, if I'm going to have it give us a greeting. Okay, and that's a good visual way to check and make sure that you've named all of your controls. And I can tell as kind of a third party, if I open up somebody's project, I can click and open this and that's exactly what I do when I grade your projects. And I can see, first of all, if you took the time to name your controls, because that's important to me. And I can also tell by looking at this a lot of things. I can see that I have one label and one text box, and they probably go together without even looking at the form itself, right? So you'll spend a lot of time learning about properties and things you can do, but that's the basic idea. What I want to do is turn my attention to the idea of an event handler. And so again, I've said that there are all kinds of events that happen as the program is running, and we want to write code to respond to those events. And there are a couple different ways to get event handling code in Visual Studio. The easiest one is to double click on a control. So if I double click on the button, I am going to get an event handler method. And at this point, I'm going to kind of rearrange my windows here. And what this gives us is a method that will execute when that button is clicked. Now, there's some things that have happened behind the scenes here that we'll look at in a moment. But for now, the way I can look at this is whatever needs to happen when they click the button, that code goes here. Okay. As a side note, what happens to many students when they're first starting to work with the design tool here is they double click on something that they don't need to double click on, like the label. Well, it turns out that you can click on a label and that's an event. A label can act like a button. I can write code for that. But maybe I did that on accident, and first of all, I end up in this view that is kind of scary sometimes to new programmers. It's just a new tab up here. But what you don't want to do at the moment is say, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to delete this code. The code's not really doing any harm right now, that method. But if I delete it, I'm going to give myself an error. Okay? And we'll look at the nature of that error in a few minutes. But for now, just understand that I'm not bothered if you have extra event handler code in there because you accidentally double-clicked on something in the design view. It happens all the time. I tend to just leave them there, especially if it's like a school project. If you really want to clean them up, I'll show how to do that in a few minutes. Okay, so I've got now two event handlers. One of them is not the right one, so I can tell by looking at the name. This one is the click event for BTN submit. This one is the click event for LBL name. I want to respond to the button click. And I'm just going to have some simple code here that pops up a little message box, a little window, messagebox.show. And I'll just make it say hello. So again, this is code that will execute when BTN submit has been clicked. So if I compile this and execute it, okay, my form is sitting there waiting for events to happen. Events are happening, in fact, but none of them are being responded to at the moment. But as soon as I click the button and wait for my slow computer, it's going to pop up a message box that says hello. Okay. This message box is actually sort of a special case here. It's going to sit there now and sort of freeze the screen. The user has to deal with this pop-up. They can't continue to kind of work on the form in the background. So that's the idea of an event handler that responds to a button click. All right, so far so good, and again, we'll learn a lot more about what we can do with all these controls and this type of code as we work through the module. But what I want to point out here, because a video format is good for showing this, is that there's a lot of stuff that Visual Studio is taking care of for us. When I add a control to the form, for example, or when I add an event handler, there is code that is being generated by Visual Studio, and it saves me from having to write the code myself. I could, if I were so inclined, I could make a Windows form and add all the controls just by writing code, the same way I'm used to doing in a console application. So this design tool is really just a tool that writes that code for us. And in our Solution Explorer here, I can kind of get a look at what that code is. So when I have a form in my project, that form is actually comprised of a few different files, and you can kind of expand that to see. I use the term code behind, which is not the right term. That's a WPF term, but I call it code behind, this code that is associated with all the event handlers, and I think of it as being kind of behind the form. And this is very visible, and I work with it very frequently. What's interesting here is that this code has what we call a partial class. And what that suggests, just as you might guess, is that there's more code related to this somewhere else. And that is right here. It's called form1.designer. And so this is also partial. This is the other chunk of code that goes with this form. And this was all created by the designer. I didn't write any of this code. And you can get pretty far in your programming life without messing with this. And what I tell beginners is don't mess with this code. Just leave it, because you can upset things that will cause you problems and eventually cause you to have to delete your form and start again. So there is a little bit of danger here if you delete something or you mess up something without understanding it. But what I want to show you is what happens if I go to my code behind file here and I decide, man, I'm really uptight and I don't like to see this empty event handler that I didn't mean to put there. If I delete that, I can no longer run my program. I've got this error, and the nature of the error is that my auto-generated code has linked to an event handler, and now I've deleted that event handler method, so there's a break, right? And what I can do is, if I look here, I can see the error. In this case, it's on line 62. It's kind of hard to see on the screen here. But it's saying that it has added to the label click event, it's added an event handler called LBL name _ click. And I've deleted that. It no longer exists. So I could delete this line of code, and that will fix my error. All right? So that's what's going on kind of behind the scenes. I'm going to put that back. And I'm going to show you that you can do the same thing without messing with this code and being in danger of damaging something in your project. So again, I like students to be aware that there is code in the background, but I want you to do things through the user interface as much as possible. So if I come back over here to, and here's the error that I have created for myself because I deleted my event handler. Okay. So that's a scary screen when you see that. Students often panic when they get that. If I want to get rid of that extra event handler and I don't want to mess with the auto-generated code, there is a way to do that within the, to sort of separate that link that has been created within the user interface. So if I click on my label, and if I look at the properties, what we've been looking at are just the properties, which, by the way, you can sort A to Z or by categories. Okay, but there's also a button here that's got a little lightning bolt, and that is all my event handlers. And so you can see there are a lot of different events that we can handle in our code, and the click event has a method associated with it. That's that linkage between the form and the event handler code. If I delete that, okay, now I'm going to right click and view my code. I could also just double click there. I could also just click on the tab, but view code. Now I can delete this because it's no longer linked to that control as an event handler. So that's the way to get rid of extra event handler code that you don't want. All right. And last but not least, this gives me a little transition here to point out that there are lots of different events that can be associated with any control. When I double click on one, it creates an event handler for what we refer to as the default event. The default event for a button is clicking, because that's typically what users do with a button. But that's not the case for every control. If I double click on a text box, it doesn't have a click event generated. It has a text changed event. So in other words, when the text that is in that text box changes, that can trigger an event. And it can actually be a really annoying event. I'll demonstrate that. That's kind of my last thing here. Let's say I pop up a message box that says, "Thanks for typing." And I put it as part of that text changed event. As soon as I type even one letter, I've changed the text. I changed it from empty string to D, so it's going to pop up. And now every single time I change anything, it's going to trigger that event. So that's a nice visual way to see how that particular event works. And again, if I decide, you know what, I really don't like that, that's not the way I want my program to behave, I can single click on the control, I can go to the event list, I double clicked so it took me to the code. I can delete that, and now I'm free to delete that code if I want to get rid of it. So that is the, as I like to say, the nickel tour of the Windows Forms Designer, and a few things to keep in mind as you're working through your experiences with Windows Forms.